Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Professor Otero at the School for International Studies at Simon Fraser University. Today, I'm going to be covering some of the main points proposed by Müller, Jan-Werner Müller, which is a male professor. I mean, some people refer to him as her. It's a him. And I'm going to present a somewhat critical take on his book. And in addition to that, we will supplement, this critique by reading Chantal Mouffe's article, which I shared with you yesterday. And I mean, I took this particular image from the article in The Guardian that, where they were publishing Chantal Mouffe's paper or article, because she deals with left or progressive populism. And so what the image clearly entails is that there can be two different types of populism. And I would argue that even though Müller mentions left populism, he focuses primarily on right-wing populism of this type here. The xenophobic type, anti-immigrant, the type that proposed Donald Trump as a leader. But we also have a left hand or a progressive type of populism that is much more diverse, that focuses much more on justice, equality, acceptance of difference, which is extremely important, right? In right-wing populism, I guess almost by definition, there would be some level of intolerance and non-acceptance of difference. The opposite would be the case in left-wing or progressive populism. So it's important to understand that. I mean, this is kind of similar to the concept of nation and nationalism that we saw in Benedict Anderson. Although the dominant form of nationalism that we have seen in recent years is, coincident with right-wing populism and so on and so forth, there has been historically also a progressive, open, internationalist, revolutionary nationalism. All right. So there is a bit of a correspondence here. And in fact, I sent you an article that I found yesterday about the book written by Bruce Ackerman in 2019 on revolutionary constitutions. I think Bruce Ackerman would also present a contrasting perspective on populism than we've seen in Jan-Werner Müller. So I'll go over this outline, introduction, what populists say, what populists do, and dealing with populists. And that is nothing more than Müller's own outline of his book. But in the process, I will be interjecting some critical commentary on my rendering of his work. So similarly to Benedict Anderson, who also claimed that there was no theory of nationalism, Müller also claims that there is no theory of populism, but in terms of its practice, he points out three main features, which are being anti-elite. In the case of the United States, well, actually, in the case of the world, it would be anti-Washington consensus. Washington consensus is the term utilized by liberal Democrats to refer to neoliberalism. I guess that's what they would consider the polite term to refer to neoliberalism. Critics like David Harvey have no qualms about designating the phenomenon as neoliberalism. And I mean, on the other hand, I guess the term has become, perhaps overused. I mean, several of my books have the word neoliberalism in their title or their subtitle. Since my first book in 1996, it's called neoliberalism revisited. And so it's also anti-pluralist, righteous in the sense that it claims moral superiority to the elite in particular, which is almost by definition considered to be corrupt, and in that sense morally pure. It may, in the case definitely of right-wing populism, it may focus on identity politics. For instance, in the United States, white supremacism, however much veiled that might be, it would be exclusionary of the others, and it tends to be polarizing. And if you witnessed the administration of Donald Trump, you would be convinced that polarizing was one of the marks of this particular administration. What populists say? I guess I used that image just because in line with Müller's characterization, the populist leader would conceive of himself or herself, there are females as well, as almost emanating, from heaven to represent the people. So, I mean, it's a little ironic, I guess. Democracy in North America versus in Europe, to some extent. So, in the 20th century, the way Müller characterizes it is that in the United States, it was mostly a social democracy or a liberalism type of democracy, or liberal democracy. In Europe, it was more about checks and balances, and perhaps very importantly, especially for Timothy Mitchell, it was devoted to restrain the popular will. So let me remind you with the next slide what Timothy Mitchell had to say about this. So the one type of democracy would be ways of making effective claims for a more just and egalitarian common world. So I guess that would be the more progressive type of democracy, the more, you could say, the way Karl Marx called it was, in his early writings at least, was true democracy. That would be true democracy. The second would be a mode of governing populations that employs popular consent, not as a way to fulfill their demands, but as a means of limiting claims for greater equality and justice by dividing up the common world. So, populism's inner logic. The first point is important. It's a permanent shadow of representative democracy, not because it is anti-democratic, but perhaps because it threatens democracy to some extent. It is a constant peril, says Müller, to liberal democracy, and seeing it makes us aware, seeing it can make us aware of democracy's shortcomings. So what are democracy's shortcomings for Müller? Well, basically that democracy has not delivered the goods for a majority of the population in terms of, particularly of reducing inequality. So populism's logic, again, I mean, this is our kind of other versions of what we've already covered: anti-elite, anti-pluralist, and the consideration of an illegitimate opposition. And I mean, this quotation comes from Nigel Farage, one of the British politicians who was perhaps one of the main instigators or promoters, depending on how you see it, of Brexit. I would see it as instigators, because I think Brexit was a huge blunder for the British people. And part of it, or part of the reason why they left the European Union, is because of people like Nigel Farage, who well, said among other things, only some of the people are really the people. And so those elites that wanted to stay in the European Union were not truly defending the interests of the people. Well, I guess the jury's still out, as to whether historically that will be a mistake or not. And I guess one of the points that we can conclude, before going to the next slide here, is that, I mean, some right-wing populist leaders have had very real consequences in actual politics and in the actual drawing of maps, national maps. So what do populists represent? And this is one of two slides. So not a will, but a symbolic substance, says Müller. And I mean, these elements here would elaborate or disaggregate what Müller means by substance. Something like defining the real American, Volksgeist. Can somebody who speaks German tell me what that means? Remember Volkswagen? Anybody knows what Volkswagen stands for?
I don't speak German, but isn't Volk people?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Volks is people, and Geist. John raised his hand. Go ahead.
Spirit.
Spirit. Yeah. So this is the spirit of the people. That's what it. And so, or plain spirit, but not in French. And I wouldn't even try to pronounce that, I suppose. Volonté générale. The substance would mean something that might necessarily be subject to interpretation. I mean, what is the spirit of the people, right? And what is the real American? And perhaps in trying to define that, any politician will have to incur in some kind of exclusion. And it's not what the people will, but what the people are, according to this completely vague definition. So what do populists represent? Number two, it's more about the ends than the numbers in democracy, right? Because, I mean, democracy is supposed to be all about elections and who wins majorities and whether minorities are suffocated by a majoritarian rule or whether minorities would have some way of channeling their grievances to the majority. Referenda tend to ratify leaders' decisions, and yet referenda are utilized by populist leaders in order to further legitimize their perhaps already taken decisions. So in this sense, Müller says on page 30, I believe, that populism without participation is entirely coherent, which is kind of a contradiction in terms, right? And so populists see themselves perhaps primarily as caretakers of, actually this is a typo, instead of or, it should be of passive people. So mandate versus free mandate, and again, I mean, this is the way that Müller depicts these two alternatives. Mandate, which would be, for the populists, tells politicians exactly what to do, and I add to this term from Max Weber, and I'll explain it momentarily. These would be based on an ethic of ultimate ends, whereas for liberal Democrats, there should be a free mandate in which representatives use their own judgment to make determinations once they are in power. And so these would expect that representatives would use an ethic of responsibility. So what would be the difference between these two ethics? Well, I mean, it's really unfortunate that Müller doesn't invoke these concepts from Max Weber, because I think that would really have clarified things to a very significant extent, and would have really explained why, in many cases, populists, left or right, are angry. And they're angry because their goals are not being attained in liberal democracy. I mean, Müller accepts that much, but he doesn't quite elaborate what is the will of the people, other than saying that they're defined by a substance, the real American, the Volksgeist, et cetera. Max Weber, in an extremely important essay called Politics as a Vocation, and I strongly recommend that text. It's only about 80 pages or so. But I mean, that contains, one of his main statements about what Weber considers to be a good politician. All right. So for Weber, a good politician is somebody that has a cause and that is passionate about the cause. So, I mean, if you're into politics simply to live off of politics, you're not likely to be a good politician. If you're in politics because you want to live for politics, in the sense that you want to give yourself to a cause, you may have a chance to be a good politician. All right. But what's the rest of the requirements? Well, the rest of the requirements have to do with the extent to which politicians balance this act of the ethic of ultimate ends and the ethic of responsibility. How so? Well, this particular essay, Politics as a Vocation, that's where Max Weber defines the state as the legitimate claim, or the entity that can have the legitimate claim to the monopoly of physical violence over a given territory. All right. So notice the word violence here. Violence for Weber is the main means of the state. So if you consider this, very seriously, you really need a tremendously strong ethic of responsibility if violence is going to be your main means, right? And ideally, in a very democratic society, you would never have to use violence except exceptionally, on an exceptional basis. So that's, the ethics of responsibility means using ethical means toward given ends. Now, the ethic of ultimate ends is different because here what's important is achieving the ends. And sometimes people will be willing to cut corners or even to use unethical means in order to achieve the end. All right. And that can be a definite temptation for politicians who have a very strong cause, a cause that they really want to fight for, and they're very morally involved in this cause. But then again, if you're a good politician, you would try to strike a balance between those ultimate ends and the ethics of responsibility of using only ethical means to achieving those ends. I'll give you one example of somebody who I think history has already judged not to have been a good politician, and I'm referring to George W. Bush. He was so eager to invade Iraq that some of his people invented the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that justified the invasion. The weapons of mass destruction, so-called, were never found, and they really devoted a lot of time and energy to find those weapons. Never found. So, I mean, that war started in 2003. By now, their leader, was slain many years ago, and the country continues to be very divided. The point is that there are decisions that leaders make that may not really properly respond to an ethic of responsibility because they are responding to an ethic of ultimate ends. So, on mandate, populists like to suggest that a free mandate is somehow undemocratic. The opposite is true, says Müller. And it is not an accident that democratic constitutions that specify an understanding of representatives' role opt for a free and not an imperative mandate. Well, I find this particularly ironic because I think it's really undemocratic. Let me tell you why. And in fact, this comes from my conversation with Bruce Ackerman a couple of years ago. Explicit conversation about the US electoral system. As we've talked about a little bit in this class, the US electoral system is predicated on the Electoral College. And each state has a number of electors, that go to the Electoral College. And one question is, how can or should those electors vote once they're at the Electoral College? What this definition of mandate would say is that if voters, let's say in California, voted massively for the Democratic candidate, the electors of the Electoral College can go there, and if they see fit, according to their own judgment, they can vote for the Republican candidate. They can change the vote. Well, I think that happens to be absolutely anti-democratic. And one of the things that Bruce Ackerman was telling me, by way of indicating that there might still be hope for the United States, is that there could be some reforms, short of having to reform the whole Electoral College, that at the state level, their legislative assemblies could modify things so that their electors to the Electoral College will have to obey the mandate of the majority. In other words, they cannot go to the Electoral College and change the vote of their constituency. Why would they do that, right? So I really don't understand why Müller would advocate for this completely free judgment of representatives. That's the ticket to undemocracy. In fact, I would contrast this with a saying by the Zapatistas in Mexico, that the Zapatista National Liberation Army that rebelled in 1994. Their main dictum is to govern by obeying. So that would be a radical statement on how to govern. Govern by obeying. Obey your constituents. You can't be elected as a representative and then go and do whatever the hell you like. No, it's not. It's supposed to be a democratic election. So you're supposed to represent a constituency. So populist leaders, for Müller, they claim to have a direct connection with substance of the people. They eliminate mediating institutions. They tend to have monolithic parties, for example, US Republicans, and they trade or market empty signifiers. That's a term from Ernesto Laclau, who is one of the authors that Müller invokes. critically, but still, I mean, I thought that was a good term to use here. For instance, make America great again. I mean, what the hell does that mean, right? Has America ever been great, really? In what sense? For whom? So, what populists do? And I guess if Donald Trump did something, well, that was tweeting. So the main problem for populists is the routinization of charisma. And what that means is, I mean, this also comes from Max Weber, charisma. A charismatic leader, by the way, I forgot to mention that for Max Weber, another feature of the good politician is one that also has a charismatic relationship with their constituency. Now, charisma is not something that the leader has or possesses. It's not a psychological feature. It's not a personality feature. It is a sociological relationship with the constituency. All right. Now, if somebody is considered a charismatic leader, that is because the people place a lot of confidence in that particular leader, in their ability to fulfill their expectations. Now, there can be, and there have been plenty of charismatic leaders that once in power, for whatever reason, are unable to deliver the goods. And at that moment, the charisma tends to evaporate. All right. So in that sense, it's a charismatic relationship, right? Because if the leader doesn't fulfill, doesn't deliver the goods, well, the people withdraw their support. You could say that perhaps something like that may have happened to Donald Trump, in the sense that only the most loyal core, perhaps the most xenophobic, the most white supremacist remain in Donald Trump's core. But other people that may have voted for him because they didn't like Hillary Clinton, well, they revised their votes, and whereas Hillary Clinton had a 3 million advantage in the popular vote compared to Donald Trump, Joe Biden had a 7 million advantage in the popular vote. All right. So very clearly, people who had voted for Trump in 2016 voted for Biden in 2020. So disenchantment with everyday parliamentary routines. And I guess if we keep to the US example, I guess people would have to be extremely disenchanted with the workings of the US Congress, because it is so polarized that it can't do almost anything. One of the main mantras of the Republicans is to obstruct. Whatever Democrats want, obstruct. So with that kind of logic, well, the country is not going anywhere. And that's why, or partly why, I guess, the Chinese rulers are laughing about how unworkable is so-called US democracy. So colonizing the state, I guess one of the assumptions of populist leaders is that the way that the state has been working has not been working for the people, and that's why capitalism, or the Washington consensus, if you want to call it in the nice way, I guess, has not been delivering the goods. And so one of the things that they try to do is to neutralize bureaucracy, to engage in mass clientelism, discriminatory legalism, which means, in Müller's word, for my friends everything, for my enemies the law, the full force of the law. And I don't know if you remember, but on the last last few days of Donald Trump in office, he pardoned a number of people who had been convicted, mostly white-collar crooks. A lot of his associates that have been put in jail because there was evidence to convict them, and Donald Trump forgave them because they were loyal to him. And for Donald Trump, loyalty was the main feature of any collaborator. So versus civil society, and the way that Müller talks about this, really, he's talking about NGOs. And I think that's a big problem because I think civil society is much more than NGOs. But anyway, this is what Müller has to say. Populism in power brings about, reinforces, or offers another variety of the very exclusion and the usurpation of the state that it most opposes in the reigning establishment it seeks to replace. So, in other words, for Müller, populism would become as exclusionary as the status quo is being of the people. I guess whether that's the case or not will depend on each historical case. I would think that this is an empirical question. Where does this happen? Where does it happen to some extent? Where does it not really happen? So here I'm going to refer to this graph that comes from a book by Charles Tilly. Charles Tilly is a sociologist, one of the main political sociologist of social movements, who conceptualizes the simple polity model in this way. So these would be the polity, the people inside the polity. I mean, this could be the institutions of government. This could be lobbyists, organized groups of some sort that have a direct interaction with policymakers, perhaps unions, perhaps chambers of commerce, entities like that. And then outside of the polity, these are the excluded in the polity. So among the excluded, there could be some coalitions formed in order to try to get in, right, into the polity, try to influence policymaking. But then you can also have external actors that try to influence some of those NGOs that Müller talks about. And as an example, I would give you something that is very hot right now in China. And I'm referring to how the Chinese government is tightening its grip on Hong Kong. Hong Kong was transferred as a British colony back to China in 1997. And there was a deal at that moment by which, for the next 50 years, Hong Kong was going to be ruled by the dictum, one country, two systems. One country in the sense that Hong Kong was part of China, but there would be two systems in the sense that mainland China would be governed by the Communist Party of China, whereas Hong Kong would have some kind of democracy. And by the way, Hong Kong was never democratic because, I mean, it was a British colony, right? So by definition, it was not democratic. I mean, there were a lot of freedoms, mind you, but it was not exactly a democracy. But now the British, the Canadians, the Americans, and a lot of other people would really like to see the Chinese take their hands off of Hong Kong and let it become perhaps a force that transforms mainland China into a democracy. So one thing that the Chinese government is clamping down on is this kind of relationship by a series of outside actors that are influencing on the democracy movement in Hong Kong, and trying to influence the government both of Hong Kong and perhaps indirectly the government of China. So that is the relationship that is being repressed by China. Why? Well, on the basis of sovereignty. If some of the democracy movement, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm sure some of you may have followed the protests in Hong Kong that started in June 2019. And I mean, one of the things that surprised me considerably was the fact that some of the protesters carried American flags. Others carried even Donald Trump images. So, I mean, what were they trying to do? So evidently, they were following an extremely simplistic logic that if our enemy is the Chinese state and Donald Trump is an enemy of our enemy, well, let's ask the enemy of our enemy for help. But I mean, what that does is only tremendously annoy the dragon, right? And so that really detonated the ire of the Communist Party. And I mean, they let the protests go on for, well, until the pandemic hit. But in the process, some of the protesters became increasingly violent. In some cases, the police responded in kind. And so anyway, I mean, things got messy. People were jailed. And I mean, one of the latest events is that one of the local tabloids in Hong Kong, the Daily News, I'm not sure what the name is, but that was, well, the government imprisoned its owner, one of the main leaders of the democracy movement. I guess somebody mentioned in a chat, the Apple Daily. Okay, yeah, thanks, Iris. So now, I think if you think about the United States and you think about organizations that are being supported, financed by outside forces, do you think they would have any qualms with quashing them? Probably not. And in fact, I mean, that has been an increasing trend in governments around the world, that where there is influence in so-called NGOs from international sources, they become forbidden. I mean, and I think that's just understandable from the point of view of sovereignty and from the point of view of non-interference. Those two are precepts that are ingrained in international law: sovereignty and non-interference. Chantal Mouffe's critique of liberal democracy, the way that Müller portrays it, is that for her, rationalist thought denies the legitimacy of conflict and disagreement because the critics of populism put a lot of emphasis on the fact of populists being angry, as if being angry for something were simply not valid. So I mean, that's what Mouffe refers to by rationalist thought. And then there's the problem of technocracy, which indicates that, and I guess, something that should be highlighted here is that it's not just any kind of technocracy or any kind of technocrats that we're talking about, but it is particularly neoliberal technocrats that are commanding the way the economy works. For instance, I mean, a lot of the, especially some of the countries in Europe, like in Greece or in Spain, there were, these vigorous mobilizations protesting against the austerity policies. but austerity policies was precisely what was recommended by the neoliberal credo. And so, that's where you have this antagonism between this technocracy that is absolutely faithful to the neoliberal model, regardless of how much pain and suffering it's going to cause to a very large number of people. And so that's why you had movements like the Indignados in Spain, which Müller comments. And so in this kind of context, Chantal Mouffe says that electing, for instance, between Democrats and Republicans in the United States is like electing Pepsi or Coke. So liberalism, Europe versus the United States. And here, the way to look at this is not a very good portrayal, but I mean, for Europe, liberalism basically means unfettered capitalism, and that is what antagonizes the populists. For instance, Marine Le Pen in France. In the United States, however, it's a different kind of liberalism, because what they would want is more maximizing the freedom and personal lifestyles. So, for instance, you have 30% of the population who choose not to vaccinate. And with that extremely sizable share of the population not vaccinating in the United States, well, the result is that infections of COVID are spiking once again. And now that we have these much more contagious Delta variant, it's going to be a big problem, because, whereas a few months ago, some epidemiologists considered that perhaps with a 60% vaccination rate, or with a 60% of people having been infected, populations would reach what's called herd immunity. Now, after the fact, after a lot more experience with COVID and so on and so forth, people estimate that you need at least 90% vaccination rates in order to achieve that herd immunity. So as long as the United States continues to prioritize individual level freedoms at the expense of public good, there's going to be a big problem. I think Canada, fortunately, has a very different kind of approach. People are much more willing to do what is right in order to protect others, rather than just defend their completely egotistical, selfish individual choices, right? I mean, in order to achieve public good, sometimes you have to sacrifice a little bit, but that's for the better good of everybody. So Müller's main point: populism is not a liberal democracy, but a defective democracy. And I guess the defective part for him is that at least right-wing populists tend to be exclusionary of the elite, or at least the elite that they are not. In other words, when populists are the elite, says Müller, they're fine with that. It is the other elite, the neoliberal elite, or the Washington consensus elite, that they're against. And populism is not a dictatorship, so that's important to understand. Populism is a phenomenon within democracy. And the rule of law and democracy go hand in hand. So when the rule of law is jeopardized, for instance, in the way the law is applied, it's not applied for my friends, but it is definitely applied for my enemies, that is definitely a problem for democracy. So collective actor, the constitution of a collective actor. I mean, there's several ideas that Müller invokes on page 70 about this, including from Hannah Arendt, from Karl Marx, and other from John Dewey. That's important. John Dewey was a very important education theorist in the 1920s, 30s, maybe until later in the United States. Very, very progressive. I really like his stuff. So anyway, the fight is for, according to Hannah Arendt, we are also the people, or something that's not quoted in Müller's book, but it's a very well-known phrase from hers, is that people fight for the right to have rights. I mean, this is what the excluded fight for, for the right of having rights, of being part of the polity. So individuals capable of acting in concert, that's what the collective actor is all about. In Marxist terms, it would be the transition from a class in itself to a class for itself. So what does that mean? Well, for Marx, a class in itself was or refers to the objective existence of the working class in production relations. The fact that a very sizable number of people sell their ability to work for a wage and have to confront employers and so on and so forth. I mean, that makes them a class in itself, in the sense that given their class positionality, they have a number of class interests. However, not because they're a class in itself will those people be aware of those interests, and much less will they get organized for those interests, to fight for those interests. That's what would happen when the class becomes a class for itself. So that transition is what it's all about, to make collective movements, collective actors. And some people tend to emphasize awareness, consciousness a little too much, but I would argue that the most determinant factor, and I mean, obviously awareness is a factor, but the most determining factor is organization. If a self-aware class exists out there that then becomes organized around their class interests, then they can become a collective actor. And see, that's what's happened in the negative in the United States, to a lesser extent in Canada, in that the working class has become deorganized or disorganized by the imposition of neoliberalism. Democracy should multiply and empirically test claims to representation. So, I mean, what Müller is saying here is that, ideally, collective actors or groups that have grievances or claims, well, they would have to become collective actors and become multiplied to make their claims to representation. In other words, to demand their right to have rights and to be included in the polity. So fear of the people by Democrats. And here I'm taking a quotation from John Adams, who was the second president in the United States. These are his thoughts, his fears, or he was expressing his fears about dealing with the term the people, which is supposed to be the core of democracy, right? I mean, democracy means rule by the people. But he was really scared about that. He said it was dangerous to open democracy. Women, God forbid, will demand the vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will want it too. Every man without property will want equality. And remember, at that time, until the late 19th century, only propertied men were able to vote. So how to deal with populists? That's the last section, or the last chapter, actually. Democracies versus populism. I mean, the whole concern expressed by Müller is that democracy may be at peril with the rise of populism. So populism rides on the broken promises of democracy. Populism is only thinkable in the context of representative democracy, which is why Müller resists calling populism as being outside of democracy. It is part and parcel of democracy. Now, the supposed polarities between democracy, numbers, and populism, substance, are also pointed out by Müller. I'm not sure of, the extent to which those polarities are there. I mean, it is true that democracy is all about elections and winning majorities and so on and so forth. But in fact, populism also, in spite of the fact that it trades in substance, in substantive alternative goals to those of neoliberalism, populism is also about the numbers, or it is not. Because I mean, once Donald Trump lost elections, well, he had to resort to increasingly undemocratic or really anti-democratic means, and the mechanisms of democracy started to work, the checks and balances, and that disabled the Trumpian attempt at staying in power at all costs. So populism is strong in places with weak party systems. That may well be the case. I mean, that I take that as an empirical observation on the part of Müller. And it may well be the case. So the boundary problem, who are the people? So democracy has no solution, in the sense that it has no clear definition of who are the people. Remember all the fears by John Adams, and at that time, there were a number of people, a large majority of the population, that were not part of the people because they were not even enfranchised to vote. All right. So it is not going to be democracy that defines who the people are. It will be other forces. So perhaps populism is the one that defines the people in the demos part of democracy. So democracy's critique of populist boundary setting, according to Müller, he is calling other liberal Democrats to critique populism without exclusion. In other words, you cannot play according to the kind of rules that populists are playing. So if populists are indeed exclusionary, then liberal Democrats cannot be exclusionary, because that would kind of be game over for democracy. If you start excluding, you need to attend to the kind of demands that are being posited or raised by the people. So a debate on boundary, even if it ends up being more restrictive, is worth having. So I'm not sure, how he would restrict things, but anyway, he prefers to have a debate and a deliberation on boundary. So one example, and here I thought this was a really interesting part of the book, very much at the end, the historical populists in the United States. And by historical, I mean at the turn of the 20th century. So those populists joined Social Democrats, they joined the progressivists, and they were inclusive of Blacks. So that there you have a really good example of left progressive populism. It culminated in the New Deal, and it went from the 1930s to the early, I have to qualify this, the early 1970s. That particular era of capitalism is the only time when capitalism has lowered inequality, all right? Any time before and after, inequality has been deepening. Cultural versus material interests. So, this is an important topic, that identity issues cannot be seamlessly translated into questions of material interests. And I mean, that's something that has been said since Max Weber. Max Weber, one of the interesting sayings is that, material interests are there always, but men and women move not only by material, but also by ideal interests or identity issues, if you want to put it in contemporary terms. And there is no direct correspondence between identity issues or ideal interests and material interests. So how do you deal with those? Well, it always will depend on the concrete, the specific situation. So there's an important difference between cultural and economic changes. Many of the former do not directly affect many individuals. For instance, this is my example, same-sex marriage. I mean, why should anybody else care whether LGBTI people have the right to marry or not? I mean, it's not going to affect them. The only thing that it might affect is their prejudices, right? And I mean, same-sex marriage, mind you, is a very controversial issue, also inside the LGBTQ community. Why? Well, because the most radical factions of the queer movement, for instance, would argue correctly that marriage is a highly conservative institution. So why should they be submitted to these conservative institutions? Leave that to the mainstream. And so, however, I mean, from a sociological standpoint, I would argue that having legalized same-sex marriage in a few countries, Canada was the 4th country to legalize same-sex marriage, I think that is a very positive step in the right direction of considering this group as part of society. Whether that's conservative or not, well, I mean, I agree it is conservative, but at least the people in the community will have the choice whether to use this opportunity or not. And I think the existence of more LGBTQ couples that are open will educate the rest of the population to realities that are not part of the mainstream heteronormative reality. So some loose ends that are treated at the end of the book. Bernie Sanders is not a populist, even though he might have mentioned him as being pointed as one of possible example. He doesn't consider Bernie Sanders to be a populist. Post-World War II European democracy was mostly about restraining the people. So in this regard, he definitely agrees with Timothy Mitchell. Integration added supranational constraints to national. I mean, here he's talking about Europe in particular. The fact that Europe wanted to become a supranational entity, that imposed further constraints on national level democracies. And I guess, because of that, you could argue that these may have been a factor in Brexit. Brexiteers wanted to do away with any supranational constraint of how to deal with their own nation. So further questions, I have 2 slides on this, and I think that's going to be the end. What are the criteria for belonging to the polity? So these are open questions that Müller throws out there for debate, discussion. Why exactly is pluralism worth preserving? That's a valid question. I mean, I'm in principle, I guess, a pluralist. And how can one address the concerns of populist voters understood as free and equal citizens, not as pathological cases of men and women driven by frustration, anger, and resentment? In other words, what are their reasons? I think that's a very important question that Müller raises, because he goes beyond treating populists as merely angry people, right? Or pathological dissenters of democracy and so on and so forth. I think unless you grapple with the reasons of people that are discontent, you're not going to be able to properly address and perhaps redress their grievances. And I'm saying as a politician. I mean, if you were a politician grappling with these issues, you have to try to see and find the reasons. And that's it.